Good evening. Good evening to all of you who are gathered here today. We want to first thank God for the privilege and the strength. And I want to thank all of the rabbis who are here, Rabbi Pressner, Jacobs, Rabbi Friedman, who used to be a part of a group called the Rabbi, the Imam, and the Preacher over in Durham. This may turn up just a little bit to Rabbi Dina, my good sister and friend, to all of you who gathered here, to the North Carolina NAACP, and all the North Carolina NAACP folks, stand up. I wanted to do that deliberately for the cameras because I want you to know we're not all black, but we are all black. I also, in his absence, our president, Cornell Brooks, I was a part of the team. I chair the Political Action Committee, and the NAACP is kind of like most of our organizations, and there would not have been a journey for justice if we'd not worked it through our structure. And so I was a part of the team as chair of the Political Action that helped work that through the structure that we might be able to go from Selma to Washington, D.C. And I want to also say tonight that even before that, when more than every year we've had the Moral March to Raleigh, the HKOJ People's Assembly, our Jewish brothers and sisters have been right there since 2007. And in 2014, when 80,000 people showed up, the biggest march for civil rights since Selma, the rabbis carried the Torah, and the Muslim friends carried the Quran, and Christians carried a Bible, and others carried their book of faith, and they were all there in the South, walking together. And every time we had Moral Monday, rabbis were there, and rabbis went to jail right here in North Carolina, believing that we would indeed one day part this sea of oppression and see victory when it comes to dealing with voting rights and so many other things. Why do I vote? I vote because I was born in 1963, August 30th, 2 days after the March on Washington. I often tell Dr. Spearman, the joke in my family was, I said, wait a minute, hold up, let's see what happens. And then on the 28th, and then I was born. But I think about that often now. My mother served in the Civil Air Patrol. Some of you may be old enough to remember that. My father served in World War II. My mother was trained at Blaine College of Business in Indiana. She was a trained concert pianist. She worked in the government. My father had 2 master's degrees by 1963 and was working on his doctoral degree, was pastoring a church in a predominantly white denomination. And yet, in his home state of North Carolina, he didn't have protected voting rights. In fact, in America, because the Voting Rights Act had not yet been signed. In fact, the Civil Rights Act had not yet been signed. And so whenever people attempt to undo the Voting Rights Act, I take that quite personally. Because to me, that's like going down to my father's grave or my son's grandfather's grave and desecrating it and dismissing the struggle. In fact, that's what I wanted to do, Rabbi Preston. I wanted to just add, like the Talmud does. The Talmud, it kind of adds to the text. Y'all didn't think I knew that, did you? it's an interpretation, sometimes an added interpretation. So I want to add just a slight interpretation to the history you repeated when you say that the Voting Rights Act was drafted in your office. I'd like to just suggest that the Voting Rights Act was drafted in the blood of those who came from Selma to Montgomery, from Swanner, Chain, and Goodman, and it was transcribed from blood to paper. If anything happened in that office, you heard the blood crying from the ground, and you transcribed that echo and turned it into a living document. I want to take this text for a moment, but it's Old Testament, and so I'm a little leery with all these rabbis. But it says, I'm going to take a little risk. In the third, and then it's in the Message Bible. It's not, my Hebrew is kind of off tonight. A long time since seminary, but in the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, I, Ezekiel, was among the exiles by the Chebar Canal. This is the Message Bible. The heavens were opened, and I saw a vision of God. And on the 5th day of the month, the word of the Lord came to me in the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim. Ezekiel, the priest, the son of Buzi, or Buzai, in the land of the Chaldeans by the Chebar Canal, and the hand of the Lord was upon Ezekiel there. It's always struck me that God initiates this conversation. God does. In the midst of all the noise of oppression, in the midst of the popular propaganda justifying injustice, in the midst of the gloating and the bragging by those committed to the politics of greed and exploitation, in the midst of formulas of religious construction being used to wrongfully consecrate meanness and inhumanity to man and woman, God initiates a conversation. Let's start with Ezekiel. God initiates it, and he initiates a call. And that says to me, Paul, that whenever oppressive forces think they have won, think they have all the political power and all the resources, and they think they have taken all the hope and faith from people who believe, God still retains authority to initiate a call and a conversation and get people together that other folk didn't expect to come together. And God tells Ezekiel, and what you were doing a minute ago, Rabbi Jacobs, what we would call in my Pentecostal background, setting the preacher up. In other words, you confirmed what the Lord gave me when you were talking about speaking up, because God tells Ezekiel to speak up. He says, first I want you to go lay down and experience what the people are experiencing. But I don't just want you to do that just for some glorified personal charity. I want you to go there and feel it, so when you speak about it, it's real. I want you to stand up and speak prophetically. The odds are against you. You're in a foreign land. It looks like the forces of injustice have more money. But I need you to raise a voice that is contrary to the voice of oppression, hate, and injustice. In other words, somebody ought to say something. Somebody. Ezekiel's call and its meaning for us today is just that. The old preachers in my community used to tell us young preachers, if you're going to preach, be ready to preach in season and out of season, when it's popular and when it's not. In fact, don't even put on the stole or the robe or the title if you're not willing to preach regardless. Preach when people are with you, but preach when they're not with you. Preach when it's politically acceptable, but also preach when it's not. Preach anyhow. And that reminds me of this story of a pastor who picked up a guy who was an alcoholic, and he was kind of drunk, and the pastor wanted somebody to go fishing with him. So he picked this guy up, and the guy got in his car, and the pastor hit a bump, and the guy started cussing. So-and-so bumped so-and-so. I can't say those words in the synagogue, but and the pastor said, no, don't say that. Don't say that. This is a holy car. This is an anointed car. You can't talk like that in this car. The guy said, what? He said, you can't talk like that. He said, all right. So they got to the river. They took out the fishing poles and the rods and the reels and baited them and commenced to fish. And after about 15 minutes, the pastor got a bite. And I mean, it was a bite. I mean, it was probably a great big old bass, and it bit and yanked his pole, and he said, oh my God, the Lord is blessing me today. And he began to reel and began to set his hook and reel it in, and the drunk guy said, come on, pastor, bring it in. He got it in, and he got that fish all the way right off to the bank. He could see the silhouette of it. He could imagine the fried cornbread and fish. He could almost smell it. And that fish came out of the water, looked at him, shook his head, and shook that hook out and went on back in the water. And the pastor sat there for a minute, and he sat there for a minute, and the drunk guy looked at him, and he sat there. He said, the drunk guy said, why are you just sitting there? He said, well, somebody ought to say something. In other words, I can't cuss, but somebody ought to. Well, God said to Ezekiel, somebody ought to say something. In fact, he said, Ezekiel says, I heard the voice, the Spirit entered me and put me on my feet. He said, I need you to say something. Now they're rebellious. The folk you need to talk to about justice. They're rebellious, and they may not listen, but I still need you to speak. Don't be afraid of them. Don't be afraid of them at all. They are rebels. They will try to continue to create injustice. But your job is to speak to them. And whether they listen to you or not, they will know that there have been a prophet among them. Say nothing is what some people tell us. I get critics all the time. Why don't you just go back into church and be a preacher? I'll go back into church and be a preacher when you stop being a crooked politician. That's when I go back. It's a form of pastoral malpractice to see your people being hurt, and then you hide in the sanctuary and just say, pray. We can't see injustice and say nothing. We can't see systemic poverty and say nothing. We can't see religion being used as a tool of hate and say nothing. We cannot see injustices and see nothing. We cannot, you're right, Donald, you're right, Reverend Matthew, we cannot see having to fight the same battles that our foreparents fought and not say anything. We have to engage in the risky business of debate with the most powerful forces of our day. We are not allowed to enter into a depressive silence or just go along with wrong and injustice. There must be a dissenting voice in every age. As Walter Wink said from Union, somebody in every age has to name the powers in order to redeem the powers. We're not allowed to check out just because Fox News has the microphone and they paid for it. We are not allowed to stand down and retreat. Son of man, stand on your feet. Son of woman, stand on your feet and speak. How else will folk know they're wrong unless there is a counter argument in the public square. Howard Thurman put it like this. He says in his book, Jesus and the Disinheritors, he says, where do we stand and who we speak for are the two questions for the faithful in every age. Where do you stand? Particularly when it comes to the disenfranchised. And so, rabbis, you are right to remind us of this prophetic work, this prophetic methodology that the word of God about justice and love is for the public discourse. I've had some folk ask me, when are you going to preach the gospel and stop preaching about social things? I said, the gospel is social. When Jesus quoted Isaiah in his first sermon, not his last sermon, in his first sermon, our New Testament tells us that Jesus rolled through all the Torah, rolled through all the prophetic line. Where did he stop? Isaiah 61. Part of it from Isaiah 58, little taste from Isaiah 59, little taste from Isaiah 60, rolled it down, didn't have an index. He just, opened the word, I guess, and he said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he hath anointed me to preach good news to the poor, just like Isaiah said in his day. And so, our speech is not promised, however, instant receptivity. And sometimes I recognize some people will not receive it at all. But we cannot judge the success of our prophetic utterance based on public opinion polls. We have to know somehow down in ourselves that the power of life and death is still in the tongue. In fact, when Ezekiel was speaking this, the context is you got to go to Ezekiel 22. I'm trying to lay a foundation for a second. It said, and the word of the Lord came to me, this is Ezekiel 22, son of man. He says, say to thou art not clean. And then he says, her priests have violated my law and have profaned my holy things. They have put no difference between the holy and the profane. The priests are just going along with whatever the crooked politicians say. This is what the context Ezekiel was in. Then he said, her princes in the midst thereof, your rulers, your politicians, have become like wolves, ravening the prey, shedding blood, destroying souls, taking dishonest gain. Your prophets have daubed themselves with untempered mortar, and the people of the land have used oppression, exercised robbery, and have vexed the poor and the needy, and have oppressed the immigrant. And God said, in the midst of that, when you got this priest misusing religion in the service of hate, consecrating or attempting to consecrate the unholy activity of politicians who are not acting like human beings but are acting like wolves. This is your text. That are acting, that are literally acting like wolves in the sense that they use their political power to devour and eat the poor and eat the widows and refuse the immigrant and undermine equality. God then said to Ezekiel in Ezekiel 22, I look for somebody that would stand in the gap and challenge what is going on. And when I hear this call from Ezekiel, I also hear Rabbi Heschel. When Rabbi Heschel said, there is no limit to concern one must feel for the suffering of human beings. He said that indifference to evil is worse than evil itself. He said that in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible. Then he went on to say, he said this, he said, for many of us, the march from Selma to Montgomery was about protest and prayer. Legs are not lips, and walking is not kneeling, yet our legs uttered songs. Even without words, our march was worship. And he said, I felt as though my legs were praying. Now that's the theological foundation. In my tradition, you have to lay a theological, if you're going to talk morally in the public square, you have to first lay a foundation from your theology, from your sacred text. And upon that foundation, it gives me a place to stand now to say we must tell the truth about the attacks on voting rights. Here's the truth that ought to make us shudder, but in the midst of it, we ought to hear that call to stand up. We have right now less voting rights protection than the day after August 6, 1965. Just let that settle for a minute. That the Attorney General from North Carolina, whose daddy fought in the Civil Rights Movement, who pastored White Rock Baptist Church some 30-some miles from this very spot, Loretta Lynch, as the first black woman, while we celebrate that, has less power to enforce the Voting Rights Act than the Attorney General had August 7th, 1965, the day after the Voting Rights Act was first signed into law. Whew. And it doesn't have to be that way, because when the Shelby decision came down June 25th, 2013, a day that will live in infamy, the courts did something very strange. First of all, the decision was 5-4. It wasn't a unanimous decision like the Brown versus Board of Education decision. It was a 5-4 decision. And then they struck down Section 4, which is the formula that tells, that decides if your state will be covered. Now, you do know that after the Voting Rights Act was passed, any state could have been released from the Voting Rights Act, the coverage, if they could have not discriminated for 10 years. Y'all didn't hear what I said. All you had to do was just not discriminate for 10 years. And you would no longer be required, you could opt out. But no state, even under Democrats or Republicans, didn't matter, was ever in the South, because that's where the Voting Rights Act preclearance mostly covers, in the South, none of them could resist the taste of discrimination for 10 years. So Section 4 says basically the formula is no longer relevant, and that meant that Section 5 now cannot be implemented. And Section 5 was pre-clearance. Let me teach pre-clearance. We need to understand that pre-clearance. The day after Shelby, the Congress could have fixed it. The 15th Amendment says the Congress must ensure voting rights. So when the Supreme Court threw it to the Congress, they didn't just throw out the Voting Rights Act, they threw it to the Congress. I wonder why they would throw it to the Congress. Could it be that this Congress can't get anything done? Could it be that they knew it could be held up? So they threw it to the Congress. June 14th, the Congress could have fixed it. June 15th, the Congress could have fixed it. But instead, the Congress has allowed the Voting Rights Act, Section 4 provision to go unfixed. I don't have my watch here with me tonight, but when I stopped counting, they had allowed it to go unfixed for more than 1,100 days. Now let's put this, that my Jewish friends are good on history. Let's put this in context. Strom Thurmond only filibustered the 1957 Civil Rights Act for 24 hours and 30 minutes. Boehner, Ryan, and McConnell have engaged in a filibuster more than 1,000 days longer than Strom Thurmond. Now, they haven't used Strom Thurmond's tone, but you don't know if somebody's racist by their tone. You better look at the trajectory of their policy, because they may be very smooth. More than 1,000 days. They've refused to fix it. And what happened? We saw, as folks have already said, states just began to open up voter suppression. 22 states with new restriction. But what you should know is that 18 of them were passed entirely through legislative bodies controlled, and this is not partisan, this is history. It's a fact from a certain party. But also, I mean, I'm a political scientist, so I'm just repeating. That's why I also said earlier that we also had to fight Democrats, because when it comes to voting rights, let me tell you something, you're going to have to fight everybody. It's not any one party. Yeah. Race was a significant factor in 11 states. And you know what those 11 states had in common where they rolled back voting rights? The highest African-American turnout in history. There's a correlation. There's a correlation. And 12 of the states had the largest Hispanic population growth where they made it. And two-thirds of the states where you saw voter restriction were previously covered in part or in whole by Section 5. By Section 5. And you cannot miss, I know, yes, there's some restriction going on in Ohio and Wisconsin and all those other places, but let me tell y'all something, brother. What we got to understand, and we got to understand what Rabbi Heschel understood, that really the voting rights restrictions that have happened since Shelby are about the South. I know I wasn't going to get an amen, so I'm going to have to prove this. You see, it ain't about northern Israel. Sometimes you really want to shut down something, you got to shut down southern Judah. Because the South has always been the place that has shifted America's history. Now, you had migration of blacks in other places, or now you have Latinos, which is why Mexico gets fitted in and some of the other places because of the Latino vote, because of the brown vote. But ultimately, the fight for voter suppression is in the South. Why? Because, my brothers and sisters, if you control the 11 southern states, the 11 former Confederate states, North Carolina, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Florida, Louisiana, and Texas, and Tennessee, if you control the 11 southern states, you control 22 U.S. Senate seats, which means you only need 4 U.S. Senate seats to control the U.S. Senate from the other 39 states. If you control the 11 southern states, you control 31% of the U.S. House of Representatives, which means you only need 20% from the other 39 states to control the U.S. House of Representatives. If you control the 11 southern states, you control 162 electoral votes, which means you only need 108 electoral votes from all the other 39 states combined. Make no mistake about it. This is a southern strategy that has existed ever since George Wallace stopped saying the N-word. He did. He stopped saying the N-word, but he didn't stop being a racist. Kevin Phillips told him in 1964, you can't win using the N-word like you did in 54. You have to change what you say. You can't even win like you won in 1962. So we're going to come up with new language for racism. It sounds like this: entitlement reform, states' rights. Then you get really abstract, tax cuts. And it doesn't sound racist. When the people who we have had to sue in this state push through this voter suppression law in North Carolina, by the way, which is the worst voter suppression in the country. Because why? If they could have won in a so-called moderate southern state, then it pours water on the hopes of any of the other states in the Deep South. That's what that was about. We were the testing ground. They never sat in those rooms and said the N-word. They never sat in those rooms and said something. In fact, they named the bill the Voter Integrity Bill. They passed the photo ID portion of it and then said it was common sense because they wanted the media to call it a photo ID bill. They did not want the media to call it a voter suppression bill. You know exactly what they were doing. You don't talk racist anymore. There's a book called Racism Without Racism. It said if you don't understand the lexicon of the Southern strategy, you will never really get at racism. Because you got to look at the policy and the impact of the policy. But also, voter suppression is a form of sin because it suggests it's all right to challenge the imago Dei, the image of God in every human being. What do I mean by that? You can only vote if you're a person. So if you suppress my vote, you suppress my personhood. Which means if you suppress the vote, you are also engaging in self-worship. And if you're engaging in self-worship, you're engaging in idolatry. And if you're engaging in idolatry, you're engaging in the number one sin in all of Scripture, self-worship. And so we've got a real situation on our hands. The courts have found in North Carolina, 3 years we had to fight, Rabbi Jacobs, 3 years. If Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act had been in place, none of these laws would have made it through preclearance. None of them. But once they removed preclearance, then we, the advocates, we had to pay or find a way to prove our own voting rights, because no longer does the government pre-clear. We had to raise all kind of money. If it wasn't for folk like Pender Hare and Irv Joyner and Al McShirley and Caitlin Swain and Adam Stein and a host of other lawyers and a law firm out of D.C. A law firm that came in pro bono. And they were betting that we weren't going to be able to wage the fight. I know I'm being a little long, but just give me a moment, because this stuff, I haven't preached since this happened. I got to get it out. I got to tell the nation. Listen, they were betting because they had our money. They waged this battle against our voting rights with our money. They took your money, $5 million of your money, and used it to hire lawyers to take away the rights and the voting rights of African Americans and Latinos and students. And all we had is a bunch of volunteers. Right, Carolyn? All volunteers. And a hope and a prayer that if we started a fight, somebody would come help us. That's all we did. We didn't know Dr. Spirit. We said, but if we just start a fight, maybe somebody will come. We just stand up, Ezekiel. And then we fought 3 years. And you know what, in North Carolina, Rabbi, and those of you across the nation, it wasn't that they were blocking us from getting same-day registration. They were taking same-day registration after it had been used in 3 election cycles. After the African-American vote went to 70%, more than any time in the history of America except during Reconstruction in 1868 to 1880. Think about that. And the whole language of fraud did not begin to happen until black folks started voting. Huh? Have you ever noticed that black people have never called other people fraudulent? We just wanted our right. We never went around and said that, even though we knew fraud was going on back in the days of the Klan and Jim Crow, but we never called people fraud. We just said, do right, give everybody the right to vote. They knew. See, President Obama, I'm doing this because y'all are national. Y'all gonna move around. I'm just a country preacher. I want you to get the story right. Obama, the president, did not win North Carolina in 2008. He did not. I know what they said on CNN, but they don't report stuff right down here in the South. He lost on election day. He won doing same-day registration and early voting. And the NAACP and our 200 and some moral money partners, we did something called the Forward Together Moral March to the Polls. And I never forget, one of the interviewers asked me, said, will a lot of blue or red show up at the polls? I said, I don't know, but I just want to make sure the black gets there. And we did. And more than 1 million African Americans and Latinos showed up in early voting. And thus, he lost. If we had only had election on election day, he would have lost. And folk know that. And so immediately, they began a campaign. It's not an new campaign. It's as old as Deconstruction in the 1800s. It's as old as the white Southern strategy of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s that continues today to deconstruct the voting patterns. Because they know that right now, if you register 30% of African Americans in every southern state that I just named, and if they vote with progressive whites and Latinos, the solid South is broken open. Those 11 states can no longer be held. And if you free up those 11 states, you free up America. That's what they know. And the question is, do we know it? I want to tell you why it was right for you to come to North Carolina. Not to highlight North Carolina, but your instincts were right. If we're going to have a campaign, we must start in the South. I'll be through in just a second, sister. But why you also have to understand, that the court found a few weeks ago, and they didn't find it one time. They found 2 times in the last 2 weeks. The first time was on the voter suppression, and they did not find disparate impact. Come here, sister. Come here. I want to show you something. Disparate impact is when I hit you. Oh, excuse me. I didn't know what I was doing. That's disparate impact. This is intentional. Oh, I'm not. My point is, the court said this was intentional. It was no mistake. This was deliberate. It was planned. It was systemic. It was surgical. It was sinister. It was cynical. And then Donald Trump came along a few weeks ago and said, well, this is going to cause all this fraud. He hadn't even read the case. And then they started saying, well, these are Democratic judges. In other words, that the Democratic judges engaged in contempt of their own court. In other words, and that's called Trumpitis, when you do wrong and then you blame somebody else for what you say out your own mouth. That's what that is. But the second case came right back the next week and said they were guilty of creating apartheid gerrymandering redistricts. In other words, how did we get a supermajority in North Carolina who could pass this voter suppression law? Well, first, they set it up in 2010 by passing the worst redistricting plan we've seen since the 19th century. They stacked and packed 49% of black voters into 19 out of 50 Senate seats and 51% of black voters into about 50 out of 120 House seats. They stacked and packed. It's called bleaching and packing. In other words, they put more blacks in a district than were necessary to fulfill the requirement of the Voting Rights Act. Why? Because they did not want blacks and Jews and whites and Latinos and other folk to get together and form fusion coalitions. And the courts said last week that was deliberate. And what can they say now? Because one of those judges who voted unanimously was appointed by a Republican. But the point I'm trying to make, my friends, is this is not tiddlywinks. Let me close here. In South Africa, they used to say, when things got real tough, only a dying mule kicks the hardest. All of this voter suppression is because they're scared of you and me getting together. It's because of your power. And because it's the last ditch effort to hold on to the solid South. It's a last ditch effort to control these southern states and a few others, but these southern states. And people are afraid. And it's connected to a racialized narrative and a class narrative about who deserves what. And that's why in voting patterns, you can trace this, that the same people who are against public education, who vote against the LGBT community, who vote against ending gun proliferation, who vote against raising a living wage, who vote against health care, who vote against immigrant rights, who vote against Muslims, are the same people who vote against voting rights. So the battle for voting rights is literally a battle for the heart and the soul of the democracy. And my brothers, we are in a serious moral crisis when politicians will welcome, some politicians welcome clergy who are loud on the issue of stopping a woman's right to choose, loud on the issue of prayer in the school, loud on the issue of homosexuality, but they don't say nothing when it comes to systemic poverty and systemic racism and voter suppression and the denial of health care and criminal justice reform and racism and raising a living wage. The truth is, we got an extreme agenda afoot, but it can't have the last word. Ezekiel, stand up and speak up. Somebody has to stand up and say it doesn't matter what party is in power or who has the supermajority. There are some things that transcend political majorities and mere majority politics and the categories of liberal versus conservative. There are some things that have to be challenged because there's injustice in the land. And at least they will know there have been a prophet among you. But then Ezekiel, like a good old gospel preacher, doesn't end with just there'll be a prophet among you. If you keep reading, Ezekiel over in Ezekiel 37 says something will happen if you speak. Ezekiel says there's some dry bones. Can I have this mic? There's some dry bones that are laying around. Can I have this mic? There's some dry bones that are laying around. And in the Message Bible, it says, God grabbed me, took me up, sat me down in the middle of these bones and had me look at them and said, they're bleached and they look like they can't live. Son of man, can these bones live? He said, I don't know. God says, start talking what I tell you to talk. Get Brother Pestner down here to talk like I tell him to talk. Get Rabbi Jacob to talk like I tell him to talk. Get Rabbi Denner to talk like I tell him. Don't worry about the bones, because let me tell you something, Ezekiel, what you don't know is bones that are dry still have ears. Lord have mercy. And bones that are dry can hear. And the Bible says that Ezekiel began to prophesy to the bones, and the bones stood up. Could it be, help me, rabbis, could it be that these bones represent people that have been bruised and battered and beaten down by the oppressive forces of this world? Could it be that these bones are people who have seen the forces of injustice win time and time again? Could it be that these bones represent people who've had the spirit and the life taken out of them by the constant battering of language and actions and the hate and the injustice? Could it be that dry bones are those who are poor, who've been told that their poverty is their own fault? Dry bones, children among us who've been discounted and criminalized because of the color of their skin. Dry bones, the sick who have heard mean politicians take health care for themselves, but then not give it to people who are sick that elected them. Dry bones, dry bones. Could it be that the dry bones are workers that have been beaten down by the anti-union forces and corporate greed? Could it be the dry bones are immigrants who've been called aliens and vilified in a land of immigrants? Could it be the dry bones are gay people who've been told in so many ways that they don't matter? Could it be that the dry bones are African Americans who see mean and power-drunk politicians working to take us backwards rather than forward, no matter what the blood of the martyrs has said? Could it be that there are dry bones laying around, but those dry bones are also the victory? Could it be that if all of us start saying the same thing, the dry bones will hear? And the dry bones will get up? Could it be, I need you to come up here, Brother Spearman. Could it be, come on, Brother Spearman, if you start preaching to the dry bones, stand right there. Could it be, Paul Anderson, if you start preaching to the dry bones? Could it be, Carolyn McDougall, if you start preaching, come on, to the Marlboro? Could it be, Jimmy Hawkins, if you start preaching to the dry bones? Could it be, Tyler, if you start preaching to the dry bone? Could it be Sylvia? Could it be Sylvia if you start preaching to the dry bones? And could it be Rabbi Jacobs? You start preaching to the dry bones? Could it be Sister Dina? You start preaching to the dry bone? Could it be Rabbi Pestner? You start preaching to the dry bone. Could it be, brother? Since Fred ain't here, come on, you start preaching. Come on, to the dry bone. Could it be? Could it be? And could it be if you hold hands? If you hold hands and you start preaching? Could it be, Pico, if you start preaching to the dry bones? Could it be if y'all grab hands and say the same thing? Could it be if you'll just preach? The bones will hear. They'll get up. And then you step back and God blows on them. And could it be that there will be a generation that will come that will say of you, you dared to speak to the dry bones. When you spoke, God blew his spirit and you changed the world and you taught everybody for ages to come that when we all get together, when we all get together, when we all get together, what a day, what a day, what a day of justice it will be.